Okay, John Dolan is a retired electrical engineer with degrees from Michigan State, Wayne State University, and Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute. He worked for General Motors, General Dynamics, Magnavox Raytheon, and as a consultant in the area of automotive safety and sonar signaling. John is a very recent member of all. And I'm going to let John tell you more about himself if he chooses to, and he can explain about. He's going to talk about airbags today, and so I'm sure we'll all have some real good questions for him. All right, John,
thank you.
You are on.
Can you hear me? Hope so. Hey, as I mentioned, I'm John Dolan. Worked for General Motors for a very long time, 30 plus years. Most of that was in the area of safety systems. And specifically in safety electronics, I was global technical lead for safety for a while for General Motors. And then after this debacle called the ignition switch issue that happened at General Motors, they made me change jobs so I can investigate things like ignition switch things and catch it before it happens, because I did happen to catch, the root cause of that particular issue. And then after that, I became a technical expert for airbags, airbag systems, and did investigation work in there. And after I retired, I started doing some consulting with like lawyers and lawsuits, sorry, lawyers and lawsuits. And as sort of like a technical expert, I just read reports and get to criticize other people's work. That's the best thing, where you just criticize other people. But like you guys can do today for me, against me, right? So I used to work for General Motors. That was my picture from about 2000. So I had no gray hair. I had hair. That was also a good thing. And I was skinnier. So I gave this talk at General Motors, and I give it for engineers. And so I looked at that presentation. I thought that would just do something like that, but it was incredibly boring. It was more on the lines of circuits and things like that. So I'm trying to change it up a bit. Hopefully it comes off. I'm going to go over how airbag systems should work in a crash and why they work like they do. So, and this is my personal experience. This is my Equinox, my 2022 Equinox. It was only a few months old, that I hit a deer in, just south of Posen. It's doing about 65. And so you can see here, the damage is not that much damage. I mean, the front fascia is broken, the bumper's broken, some curled up hood, but really not much physical damage. Or if you can see inside of the vehicle, by the way, that's my wife. She's using the dog's blanket as something to keep warm. So dog wasn't in the car, but we had the blanket in there, so cold night, so she's keeping warm with that. You see all the airbags have deployed inside the vehicle. And specifically, so the driver airbag deployed, the passenger airbag deployed, the frontal. And because the system thought this was a severe accident, even though the damage was minor, the side airbags also deployed. And so if you can kind of see this piece right here, that's a piece of the interior trim from the what's called the A-pillar. So when those things deploy, they tear the inside of your car apart. When deploys on this side, it tears your instrument panel apart. And so with minor damage from the deer, there's major damage from the crash. And so I called the insurance company. They gave us, your airbags deploy? Yes, the car is totaled. So brand new car totaled for hitting a deer with not much damage. So just because the cost to repair this type of stuff is high. Now, if I had to pay for it, if I didn't have insurance, I would probably be not happy. But because the insurance paid for it, it didn't matter very much to me. But there's a reason the system acted like that. So this is a graph of the chance of having an airbag deployed or having an accident, and also the severity of accidents. So it's obviously, it's intuitive that there are a lot of low severity accidents. So accidents that don't really need, that cause minor damage, which kind of mine is kind of in there, relatively minor damage, and don't need to have anything special happen in the vehicle, like airbags going off. And then, the higher severity accidents, so things where you're doing, let's say 35 or 65 or 70 miles an hour and you hit something, those are actually relatively rare. The vast majority of accidents happen at relatively low speed. You cause some damage. How many people have been in an accident here, a frontal accident? Wow. Well, I guess you guys are all older, so you had a longer time to drive. But so the odds are basically about 1 chance in 30 per year that you would be in a frontal accident. But the odds are that it's about 1 chance in 250 that your accident was severe enough to have your airbags go off. And then the very worst is 1 chance in about 4,000 that you'll be in a fatal accident. So it's not, and I would guess that 1 out of 30 is actually, it's a lot less than that, because people aren't going to report to the police that they hit a rock in their driveway or something like that. So the airbags are supposed to deploy in a moderate and severe accident. So my accident down here was relatively minor. It shouldn't have deployed, or it wasn't needed, I should say. There was a reason why it deployed. But it really weren't needed. And then, so things that the purpose of an airbag, of course, is to mitigate injuries, so to reduce the amount of injuries that you would receive. See, and the airbags go off, they actually go off really, it's not like a fluffy pillow. Those things are going off very fast, like inflate at like 200 miles an hour. So if you're too close to them, that'll be a problem if they hit you. So in general, the metrics, so like what you're judged on by the government, are usually very high severity crashes. And, you want airbags to go off on moderate crashes. And so on the low end ones, you don't want it so sensitive that somebody could walk up to your car, punch your car, and the airbags go off. Obviously, that would be a sport for teenagers to do, right? That's what they do every time they see somebody at a stoplight. But not really. I had like an abrasion on my hand, which is the typical, because it's the kind of rough material, So when it went off, it sort of just scraped my hand. Not in my face. So we'll get into how fast. It was so I hit a deer. So it didn't change my speed very much. By the way, the severity is in something that normally measured in something called delta V, or change in velocity. So if I was going 65 miles an hour and I hit a brick wall, my delta V for that crash would be 65 miles an hour. So, but as I was going 65 miles and I hit a deer, my speed didn't change that much. So it changed like, a 200-pound deer, a 3,000-pound car, probably changed in the order of 4 miles per hour, not very much. So I didn't need an airbag. My head never went forward enough that I would hit the steering wheel or anything like that. So I really didn't need the airbag. So here's a little commercial by our government, and they have this is from their website. And it's so the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. They say that over 50,000 lives have been saved by airbags over the last 30 years. And that's probably right, but the more accurate statement, airbags may have helped save 50,000 lives, because there's all this other things that happens to vehicles during that time period, like they got better. And so everything together, people using seatbelts, you have a shoulder seatbelt now, all these things help. And not just airbags, but since that's their job to regulate airbags, they make it seem a lot more important than it probably really is. So, yes, sir. Oh, yeah, road design. I agree 100%. Things have gotten, once you start paying attention to that, previously, the automakers really didn't, as long as it looked good, it was going to be sold and people would buy it. But now safety can actually be something that people would buy. That's actually why I bought that Equinox for my grandchild. It had all this safety stuff on it. Like it could drive itself down the highway, would brake for you. It would pre-impact braking down to 0, which is kind of a big deal, where it would stop itself when it saw something in front of you that it was going to hit. Didn't see the deer though. And so it had all this fancy, cross traffic alert, rear traffic alert. But it didn't matter when Mr. Bambi came out and nailed me. So this was just sort of an overview of a vehicle. So the airbag controller, and I used the General Motors acronym SDM, but it's airbag controllers, or as General Motors called the sensing and diagnostic module. It's kind of in the middle of the vehicle, and this is typical. And it's on the center line of the vehicle, because the inside of this thing, it has a lot of sensors. It's measuring yaw, so the vehicle doing this. It's measuring roll, so the vehicle doing that. And it's also measuring, impacts from the side and impacts from the front. There's also these remote sensors that are also measuring impact. Now, this is on a relatively modern vehicle. In the olden days, like the mid-2000s, there would have been maybe only one sensor up front or no sensors up front, and certainly nothing really on the sides. So over time, the testing has gotten more stringent. There's consumer metrics, so things that people want to see that their car will do, and you started putting sensors on the side. And the ones I've marked with A are ones that measure acceleration. And so that can tell you how much change in velocity, or how severe the accident is. There's also that it's a very tough thing to deploy an airbag in time for a side impact on like the driver's door, because if you think about it, you hit a car on this side, you got a long way before the vehicle crushes and it hurts you. But if it hits you here, you've only got this much before it's touching you. So you got to get that airbag out in time, and it's got to slip between you and the door in that time period. So it's got to be very fast. So put a pressure sensor in there, so something that just feels big pressure waves, but it only works for something hitting the door, the driver's door. And so it's parallel with that. We usually put something that can measure acceleration, that sort of measures acceleration if anything hits the side of the vehicle. But by far, this is way more sensitive. So going back to my crash, Mr. Deer kind of hit right there. So that would be right on this sensor. And how things work is that that sensor probably, at least in the beginning parts of the accident, saw a relatively big hit right on this part of the vehicle. Now, they don't just deploy airbags because one sensor says that there's been a hit. So it needs to, particularly, it needs to see something on other sensors, in particular, the big one in the middle, the airbag controller. And so I hit it there. It saw a relatively big hit, and I hit a deer at 65 miles an hour. So it changed my speed about 4 miles per hour, maybe a little bit more, maybe a little bit less. It kind of went flying off, so it probably was a little bit more. And so that was enough for this main sensor to say, yeah, something big is hitting there. We're saying something is hitting also. Time to deploy the airbag. And so it deployed the airbag. So not that that was really required in that particular accident, but there are other accidents that start out looking exactly like that you would want your airbags to deploy. Show an example of that. Oh, here's a great video. Now this video is by the Insurance Institute for Highway Safety, or IIHS. Been there a few times. So they're kind of funded by the insurance companies, and they run tests to not only verify that automakers are building their cars right, but they also come up with tests that will address problems that automakers have. And this is a great video. This is a video of a modern car hitting an old car, and they weigh about the same. So it's a Chevy Malibu against a Chevy Bel Air. So there's 50 years difference between these two vehicles. And we always taught that back in the olden days we built things really tough. Well, yeah, you did, but you didn't really do the work that was necessary to protect protect the occupant. So if you, even in this video of that side view, you could see the crush. The crush came in onto the occupant of the Bel Air. And you got to remember, he has a lap belt, but he doesn't have a shoulder harness, and there's no airbags, but it kind of doesn't matter for this. So watch this. Interior view. He didn't have an airbag, but and he didn't really go forward because he wasn't wearing a shoulder strap, but it didn't matter because the steering wheel came back to meet him. And that's just because, you know, the crush went all the way through the vehicle. And when they show this, this is the Malibu. So that's Malibu is made to crush in the front without trying to protect the passenger. So look at same impact. There's really no change in the interior of the vehicle. And the airbag went off, and that colored paint was just to show that the dummy had touched the airbag. Also, if you looked back at it, you see that the shoulder strap is kind of catching him a little bit and starts slowing the body down before it really, you know, hits anything hard, and it eventually hits the airbag, which is deflating at that particular time. It's inflated and then it hits and it deflates. And it's, you know, it's hard when it hits it and slowly slows them down slowly. So, you know, analysis on the accelerometers in the side of the dummies, the person in the Malibu would have either walked away with no injuries or very minor injuries, but the guy in the Bel Air would have been fatal. So that shows you how things have changed. So yeah, they don't make them like they used to. They make them a lot better. And that whole 50,000 lives saved, well, an awful lot of that was because the vehicle deformed better. So it kind of protected where the people are sitting a little bit better. You have 3-point seat belts now, and actually you use them, right? Because in the olden days, now it's something of the 95% seatbelt usage. And I can't believe there's 5% of the people who don't wear their seatbelts. But back in those days, 20%, 10% of the people would wear their seatbelts. So that's very important. And then airbags help out, sort of like the last ditch effort. Okay, it's more complicated drawing. So this is a typical plot that you would see the crash guys show. So this is accident severity, and it's in delta V, so change in velocity. The numbers I don't really, I asked for something that showed confusion between a deploy accident and a non-deploy accident. So this blue trace is the change in velocity over time, and this is in milliseconds, so very quick. And this blue trace is something that was non-deploy. This probably actually looks very close to what my accident was. You know, it just sort of nice even deformation, got about 4 miles per hour change, and it's being overlaid by a crash that it should have deployed the airbag. So this is the red one, and this jagged line would be because, you know, as it's crushing into the vehicle, everything is not perfectly even, and it's, you know, crushing the bumper, then it goes past the bumper and it kind of moves freely. It doesn't start slowing down. Then it hits something, the engine, and starts going faster or starts slowing down faster. And so what they say, what's indicated here is there's signal separation, though, difference between the deployment and non-deployment and deployment, but it doesn't happen to 20 milliseconds in this particular crash. However, to be able to get that airbag out in a severe crash, it needed to come out at 12 milliseconds. And so at this point, it really couldn't tell whether that I'm hitting a deer or I'm hitting that Bel Air, right? And so it has to make a decision at this time, get the airbags out, and makes a decision on the safe side. It deploys the airbags. And later on, if you could have waited longer, you can easily distinguish between the two crashes, because the delta V would have, because it was a 35-mile-an-hour crash, the delta V for the one that should have deployed would have been 35 miles per hour way down here. But for the crash that I was in, it was like 4 miles an hour. It's pretty close to this blue line. So, but there's things you have to do to be able to get those airbags out. It takes, you know, quite a bit of time in crash time to deploy an airbag, like 25 milliseconds. So it's got to detect the crash, decide to deploy the airbags, tell the airbags to deploy, they have to inflate, and they have to do all that before your face is near the airbag. Any questions on this one? This is a tough slide. Okay, so back to this little drawing. So this is by the way, this is what the the airbag controller looks like. It's a box about this big. It has a fairly decent sized microprocessor in it. So it's a fairly decent sized computer, fairly strong computer. Actually has two of them in there because one is always looking what the other one is doing, because you don't want one to screw up and make your airbags deploy when you're driving on the highway and not hitting anything. So one monitors the other. It it gets all the inputs from all the sensors, and there's more than just these sensors. There's things in the seats. There's information for the vehicle. And then once it gets that information, decides that it needs to deploy the airbags, it sends a small electrical signal to the airbags. Here's $1 million special effects. The airbags deploy, and I've shown 6, 8 airbags, somewhat of a typical arrangement from 10 years ago. Frontals, perhaps thorax bags, so airbags that come out of your seat. And if it was rollover capable, you would tend to get this big airbag that would come down from the side. Now, most of these airbags, they pop out, they inflate, and they deflate. And during the time of an accident, you're blinking your eyes. And when you finally open your eyes, you see a deflated airbag there. Because it opened, you hit it, and it collapsed, and that's all you see. The side ones, though, when they roll over, they'll stay up and they become a pain in the butt to get out of. Like in my vehicle, like I had to, tried to cut them. They were too tough for me to cut. I had to kind of lift them up, and they're pretty full, and slip out underneath the door. But there's good reasons. Well, and by the way, in the airbags, I'm sorry, I had a bunch of old airbags, and I had a bunch of old controllers, and I think I threw them away after I retired. But these things, like I said, they're not soft when you hit them. They're hard. And not only are they hard, but they're constantly being inflated. And there are big holes in the back of these things. They're constantly ejecting gas at the same time. So the inflators are inflating them. There's holes where they're deflating. It's all happening really fast, and boom, in the instant that you blink your eyes, they're out and back and deflated and just laying there. Matter of fact, I used to investigate customer complaints that said my airbags just sort of fell out of the instrument panel, or fell out of the steering wheel. That's just because it happened so fast you didn't see it happen. Because to get out of the steering wheel, it had to blow apart plastic to get out. So you knew it inflated because it came out. So as I mentioned, you could say a little teeny electric current goes to these airbags, and among other things, and they goes to something called a squib. So squib is also an explosives. That squib is also what initiates a stick of dynamite. And that's kind of the same thought process here. It's a little teeny thing about the size of a dime. And inside of it actually is a small bit of explosive. The electrical signal comes in there, it starts burning a wire. This wire catches the propellant, the charge as it's called, on fire, and so it explodes. And but it's very small and make a pop like a big firecracker. And but it's enough to generate a pressure wave and a heat wave that will catch the remaining propellant in the airbag. So this is a cutaway of an airbag. This blue stuff here is the propellant. The initiator is this teeny thing right there, barely seen, but most of it is something we call propellant or generate. And when they call it propellant, is because it is the same stuff you'd use in a rocket. It generates a lot of gas, shoots gas out really fast, and it burns, and it shoots stuff out really fast. But it does take a lot to get it going. So it takes that little small explosion to get it going, and then it starts burning. It fills, and this is in the course of 4 milliseconds, it's built up enough pressure probably to pop open these seals, these metal seals that are on this inflator. And so this inflator, picture a soup can or something like that, made out of metal, but thicker metal. And it breaks open these holes on it, and these holes vent into this airbag, and this airbag starts filling up, and this airbag fills up so strong that it tears this piece of plastic right off your steering wheel, and it inflates. And this is a passenger side one, generally more repellent, and I assume that's something called a hybrid inflator. So they don't really, there's a few airbags, inflators actually use stored gas. So like a scuba tank, pressurized with gas. However, it's kind of a crappy, not a very efficient method to do it, because when you start venting this pressurized gas, it comes out really cold. And when it comes out cold, it doesn't take that much volume, so it doesn't fill your airbag very well. So in a hybrid, they'll also burn some of the propellant, and that's burns really hot. So they can mix the two, and so the gas is more of a room temperature type thing, and it will expand big enough to inflate the airbag. So these are the typical airbags. However, more stuff goes on when you get in an accident. So this is something called a pretensioner, and it's in your seat belts. And so if anybody's been in a deployment accident, and their car is new enough to have pretensioners, after done, like the seat belts are incredibly tight. They're like rubber bands. You vibrate them, they won't move. And that's because the pretensioner has gone off. And what happened, this is an old style, but this is where you put the buckle in. So you clip the buckle into here. And this thing is, there's a wire that goes through there, and there's a little pulley in there. And if the airbag controller commands deployment, a little explosion happens in here, and this is like a cylinder with a piston in it, and it forces this piston backwards. This is tied to a wire, and it pulls this whole assembly. See this accordion thing, pulls this whole assembly down, and it jerks it down, and it tightens both your lap part and your shoulder part. And it's doing that so you can slowly ride down and slowly slow your body down so you don't get injured. So that's all. It's controlling how fast you decelerate. Because you're driving along at 65 miles an hour, you hit a brick wall, your car's stopping, but the person inside the car is still going 65 miles an hour. And you got to slow them down before they hit something, like a dashboard, or you get an airbag out in front of you. But and this pulls the seatbelt tighter and sort of slows you down, and the seatbelts will give. As a matter of fact, some of the seatbelts will have little sewed, sewed pieces that if you pull it hard enough, it'll break apart, and it'll give you a little more slack. And so when these things, when you start hitting it, and it'll break apart and it'll slow you down even slower, because you don't want big marks across you from the seatbelt pulling on you really too tight when you get in an accident. There are also more fancy stuff too. So we used to pop roll bars, explosively raise roll bars up on a convertible out of Europe. We used to, I don't think we do this anymore, but on electric vehicles when they first came out, you're always afraid of the person coming to rescue you, or fireman, electrocuting himself because the electric current is still going there, and unlike a fire, you can't tell that the thing is electrified. So there was an explosive cutoff switch that we'd deploy it, and it would cut the power from the battery, and then the fireman could come and not have a danger of being electrocuted. And there's some other things, at one time there was the coolant that was used in the air conditioners wasn't very good for you to breathe. So they deployed something so that coolant couldn't get inside the vehicle. Is there a question?
These systems
Yeah, they kind of do their own thing. They're not even standard across the manufacturer. So there'd be different types of pretensioners within the vehicles of General Motors. And again, so we would use 3 or 4 suppliers to build our airbag system, and each one would have their own design. And though the requirements of the vehicle would be the same, how the different suppliers met those requirements might be a little bit different. So for example, the pretensioner. So we don't really use that anymore, because to meet our requirements, now you need one to pull on the shoulder part of the belt and pull on the lap part of the belt. So you have 2 different ones, and you have to time them during a crash so they don't put too much stress on your body. And we don't want to go there, but yeah, that's why my car was totaled, right? Because each one of these things. So, okay, just roughly $400, $400. The belt itself, $200 per part, and not only that, so in my vehicle, when you have a deployment accident, you're supposed to replace the seats too. And I don't know if you ever tried to get a seat replaced, but that's $2,500 a seat. So it's all this adds up. I'm sure the cost would be lower if insurance wasn't paying for it because people would complain. And actually that comes to some of the thinking about questions at the very end that, well, you know, that's cost a lot of money to repair. The car was, you could drive that car. And if I wasn't leaking a little bit of coolant, I could have driven that car. But so somebody didn't have insurance or somebody didn't have very much money, you know, they just cut those airbags off and drive around. And yeah, we ran into that. So, so this is the business portion of the airbag system. Okay, and this, I love this video. This is the guy is okay. Well, he was stunned a little bit, but there's a bunch of drunk Russians. So they have, see right there, that's a passenger side airbag. So the one that I'd shown you previously, roughly the same. They stuck it in a stack of tires. They put a little cushion on top of it, and they get this guy in the early part, and you can see him drinking. They get this guy to sit on it. So this is what you don't do after you've been drinking. And yeah, they speak in Russian. It sounds like Russian and they look like Russian. They're drinking like Russian. So I just say they're Russians.
Oh,
Boom, he shoots up. He goes quite a bit. He hits the ceiling and bounces off. He's okay. By the end, in the long version of this, he starts drinking again. So to kill pain. So that is actually why you don't blow the airbags off just anytime you think you're in an accident. And going back not very long ago, there were a lot of fatalities from airbags going off. So in the 1990s and the early 2000s, there were a lot of kids injured. You're not supposed to have your kid in the front seat, but kids were injured because they're riding in the front seat. And matter of fact, there's horrific fatalities of decapitation and things like that. A child, standing on the seat, the hands on the airbag, the driver's not paying attention to the kid standing there, and it blows so hard that the kid is thrown in the back seat and literally blew their head off. So horrible accidents. So the government, in their wisdom, said that we need to put things in the seat to determine if there's a child sitting in the seat, even though it's somewhat against the law, I believe, to have a child in the front seat. You need to have something in there that can determine if you're a small person or a child, and if they're in there, you turn the airbag off. And so I did a lot of work on these things because it is not an easy problem to be able to reliably measure that a child is in the seat and that an adult, and because I wanted child in the front seat is very, very rare, but the consequences are very bad if you got in an accident. And so to reliably do that was a tough problem because what's considered an adult is actually kind of a smaller woman of about 102 pounds, and most of her weight is going to be through her legs, so she don't really put a lot of weight on the seat. Meanwhile, a 6-year-old child in a heavy child seat weighs more than this woman as far as what's on the seat. So it became a tough problem. You needed some metric of how big they are, and also kind of the pattern that they were putting on the seat. And there's also things are put in the vehicle that really it matters how close you are to the airbags. And so there's something in the seats that shows if you're too close to the airbag, it doesn't turn them off, but it only deploys them at 3/4 power. So I forgot to mention, so in my accident, it was considered a big accident, so it went off in full power. But every accident, you decide, the system decides, oh, this is a severe accident or not a severe accident. So let's say roughly 12 miles per hour change in velocity, the first part of the airbag should go off. And then maybe at 16 miles per hour, if it's considered a major accident, that the remainder of the airbags go off. So think of it as two-thirds inflation, and then you get the extra 1/3 if you are in a severe accident. And also roughly 8 miles per hour, that's when the seatbelts start going off. So you could actually get in an accident and your seatbelts tighten up, but your airbags don't go off because it's just in that zone that seatbelts are good enough to stop you, but your head is not flopping forward enough that you need an airbag to help you. That's about it. I think that's it. And I was going to entertain questions and also go over things to think about. So as you mentioned, the cost of replacement parts. So a minor accident and my brand new car was totaled. You know, and they sold it off to scrap, but I bet you when they sold those things, somebody probably bought it and salvaged the title and could repair it. Now, how they repair it is an entirely different story, right? They could just cut all those airbags that are hanging out and you could drive it, put a new radiator in it. So hopefully they did a better job. And it's not so bad for the person that's repairing because they kind of know what's going on, but who they sold it to later on, they may or may not know that there was a problem. So that most of the time that airbag controller, all it does is just go around and say, that airbag connected, yes. That airbag connected, yes. That sensor works, yeah. Just, all it does is diagnose the system is working. And if it doesn't work, a little light comes on, little messages show up, your airbag system, something wrong with your airbag system, take them into service. We'd get these vehicles back and people would take a piece of black tape and put it over the little light to show that there was a problem. Somebody did that. People do that just so the light doesn't annoy them. And I hope that that wasn't there when they bought the car. Another thing that happened, particularly when we were investigating some of these issues with airbag inflators, you get these cars back and they replace the part. They'd send us the part for us to look at to determine if there was an issue in the case of Takata airbags. Well, look at these airbags and I'm like, this is not our airbag. And so there was a couple websites and it was, of course, China, right? And they're like, airbag, better than new, you know, buy it from us cheap, and it's better than what the manufacturer put in. And you know, that is absolutely false. It took a lot of work to make these things deploy like they should. The shape of the airbag is very important. The speed of deployment is very important. And actually, some of these actually didn't deploy. All they were was just a fake. And so, you know, when we started getting these back, we reported to the government, they shut down those websites. So I'm sure they're back up again now somehow. You know, somewhere there's a will, there's a way, and you're going to save, you know, $100. You might just buy something that's counterfeit. You know, so if you're sitting, first of all, you should never be sitting close to it, right? But you're going to smack your head into essentially something that's kind of hard. And so, yeah, it'll hurt you. You'll probably get cuts. I've seen people. So I used to investigate complaints that airbags hurt you, and you get cuts here and here. But if it's gone off and it was enough for your head to be flying into the airbag, you were probably, so in my accident, my head didn't go even close to the airbag, but because I didn't slow down fast enough. But if your head hits the airbag, you're going pretty fast, it probably would help you. You know, the grand scheme of things, your injuries are less than what would happen. Yeah. So it kind of it kind of is like this. It's supposed to, you know, kind of hit your head. It's what's really one of the more important things it's trying to do is slow your neck from doing this, right? But obviously from that one video where the dummy was in the older car, his chest hit the steering wheel. So in that case, it would have helped him. It would have helped him a lot, actually, in that particular. Yeah, sort of, because eventually the steering wheel in that old vehicle, you know, was going to go right through the airbag into the guy, right? Yes, glass is not so good, but it's probably better than not having it. One thing, I see this all the time, and matter of fact, I see, you know, I always think that what a waste of money, that thing in there that it detects children, because there are no real injuries from children anymore sitting alone in the front seat. And I think that, and then I see somebody driving down the road with their kid in the front seat. Or, you know, I hate when I see this. This is common, especially young girls. They sit and they put their feet up onto the dashboard. Oh my God, if that airbag went off when you're sitting like that, you'd be flipped around backwards in the back seat and probably break your back in the process. So, you've gotta remember, that there's something in there that's going to inflate very powerfully, get in an accident. And again, I used to do a lot of work for lawsuits. Some work for lawsuits, but typically when it was an odd crash. People are leaning out the window, yelling at somebody else, and they get in an accident. My airbag didn't go off. Well, because you weren't on the seat, and plus it probably wouldn't have helped you because it's made for somebody being sitting on the seat, not leaning out the window and yelling at somebody. Had a lot of weird ones. We had people shooting their airbag and they're asking why it didn't go off. This one where this woman was hitting her husband, and he was driving and was hitting him, and so she kind of lifted off the seat, and so her passenger side airbag didn't go off, but his did go off. As he was being hit, he kind of drove into the embankment, and they were suing General Motors, and they probably got a good chunk of money for it, but they were actually both neither one of them had serious injuries. So some other things, so when we started putting electronic brains in these things to deploy the airbags, it was, the 2000, maybe a little bit earlier. And those things the electronics at that day was only good for like 10 years, especially the memory in these things. So these things, and I say good, they're only guaranteed to work for 10 years. So now these things are, 20, 30 years old, things are breaking. And the little light is coming on, and the problem is you can't buy a spare part for it anymore, because ever try to buy a piece of electronic equipment that's 20 years old? They quit making them 10 years ago. They quit making them 20 years ago. It was probably obsolete when we started putting them into a car. So it's very hard to get replacement parts. So either you just drive around with no airbags, or you have to scrap the car that's working perfectly well. Good enough to drive around. Or, which is the worst, and the part that bugs me, you give it to Junior because Junior drives the junker, right? But that means he's driving something that probably doesn't protect him as well as it should. And not only that, but so those rates that I gave you of 1 out of 30 being in a crash, chance of 1 out of 30, yeah, that's in general, for a young male, that's like 1 out of 5. It's really high rate for a young male, and it also varies by vehicle. So vehicles like we would buy, middle-aged or older people, they have very low airbag deployment rates because we drive better. But you get like a muscle car-ish type things, or even anything that's ever used in NASCAR. NASCAR, they put a shell around there that kind of looks like a production vehicle. So we had an Impala, an older GM car, and a Monte Carlo. They're exactly the same car, except they have a slightly different body. The accident rate was 10 times higher on the Monte Carlo because it was used as a NASCAR car. And so the type of people who would buy that are these young males who drive aggressively, and they tend to get in accidents. So a big variability on the rate of deployments, rate of crashes. There's also, I don't know if you noticed, but when that Bel Air hit the Malibu, you saw this dust come out, and it's coming out of the Bel Air because the Bel Air was 50 years old. It had a lot of rust, and so its structure wasn't the same. Yeah, for that vehicle, it didn't really matter very much. Its structure wasn't as good as when it was made. Now, what happens to the vehicle that's been tuned to deploy with that airbag? Actually, the crash pulse, you would think, would become softer if the vehicle has aged over time. So it may not work like it did originally when the vehicle was developed. So these types of things, the government would always ask us, and we go, we have no idea. And they say, well, why don't you test it? Well, how do you test this infinite ways that a vehicle could age? How would you do a comprehensive test on that? We could get a vehicle from Arizona, and a pristine and would probably work exactly like new. We did test ones from Michigan, and they worked all right. But if we tested one from, let's say, the maritime provinces, so up in Canada where things rust instantly, who knows how those would have gone. And not only that, what happens if the car had been in an accident beforehand and so it already slightly damaged? All these stuff you don't know, so. And, again, replacement parts, we're worried about somebody selling you a counterfeit. And actually, we had ones that didn't even have an airbag in it. It had enough there that the airbag controller thought there was an airbag, but the actual physical part of the bag itself wasn't there. And then there are some more recent issues. And so there was the biggest recall in automotive history was because of Takata airbags. And they, it's an interesting problem. Okay, I don't want to, it was mostly two automobile manufacturers that had the fatalities and all the issues. And they used Takata airbags quite a bit. And they also used Takata airbags during a time of, let's say, quality wasn't as good as it should have been. And what happened, and I took this from the LA Times, it's actually incorrect how they say with the root cause, but if there's moisture inside of this sealed can, so moisture over time can get into it, or if you had poor quality, it was built with moisture in it, and you're in a hot environment, you needed a hot environment also, that when it would heat up during the day, the moisture would be in the air that's inside of that inflator, that sealed container. And when it would cool down at night, the propellant sort of attracted water. And so over years of time, the water would go in and out of the propellant. And what it would do is, I'll say, it sort of made them fluffy, made them less dense. And if you took a piece of paper and you lit it, it would burn at a certain rate. But if you tear it up in a whole bunch of little pieces, like into powder, it burns really fast. And so that's what was happening here. And the Takata problem is their propellant had formed cracks or had broken, and there was more surface area. When it started to burn, when that initiator went off and it started to burn, it was burning a lot faster than it was originally designed for. And it was burning so fast that remember, it's generating a lot of gas, and the gas is being vented out the sides. Well, those holes are made to vent out a certain amount of gas to keep that airbag inflated at a certain rate for a certain amount of time. It's generating gas faster than that. And so the pressure would build up inside of that, and this can would break. And unfortunately, and particularly in this particular design of the Takata airbags, GM didn't use those in America, but we did use them other places in the world. This whole section right here would tend to shoot out, and it couldn't go backwards because the steering wheel was there. So it would only go forward. And so it is right there, right in front of your face. It's not coming out super hard. It's not like a bullet, but it's coming out pretty fast. So if it hits you in the eye, it could kill you. And more importantly, it could hit you in the neck, cut you. That's what a lot of fatalities were. In the soft part of your neck. Or it would hit you in the face and you'd have bad cuts and things like that. So injuries and fatalities. And that was their issues. So General Motors did use it in the passenger side, but wasn't as big a deal. We did end up recalling them after a while, even though our testing showed that our particular design we used would last like 30 years. But, everybody else is recalling, and some of them, the oldest ones, are about 20 years. So might as well do it now, if you're going to have to do it at 30 years. So, and then there's the most recent one is a company called ARC, and they have an issue. So they have, let's say it's this similar. It's not quite, doesn't quite look like that, but if they have similar style inflators, the way they welded the two pieces together is that they would spin one really, really fast, and it's called friction welding, and they push the two pieces of metal together. And they would, enough friction heat from friction would occur. It would essentially weld the two pieces together, and it works quite well. As a matter of fact, a lot of wheels are made like that. The only problem is that it's not a clean weld, and little pieces of slag and stuff would maybe inside of the inflator. And so you got this little piece of metal and floating around here. When the airbag, you have to be in an accident there for both of these issues. The airbag has to go off in your accident. Instead of helping you, it's hurting you. But the little piece of metal would fly around and jam into that hole. And it's the same thing as as the Takata, you burn gas, generate too much gas. In this case, not letting the air out fast enough, or the gas is out fast enough, and it would build up, and same deal, it would explode. And so right now there's a big lawsuit between the government and ARC, whether they're supposed to recall or not. And I haven't really paid attention to who's winning and if the government just told me you have to do it or not. Because they didn't necessarily believe that that root cause is the real root cause. I think that's about it. This is a great part for questions, particularly if you've ever been in an accident, you know, and you didn't think it worked like it should. So this is interesting, and it's that we do have airbags for second row and third row, but they don't, there's really not very many injuries from, first of all, it's unlikely you have a second row or third row occupant. And then they don't go flying off and hitting something hard, like that steering wheel doesn't come at you. They hit what amounts to the seat in front of them, which is kind of soft. It's not so good for if you're wearing a seatbelt, it doesn't really hurt that hard. If you're not wearing a seatbelt, actually, it causes serious injuries to the person in the front seat, because the person in the back seat flies out, smashes into the back of the seat. The seat gives way because they do deform. They're made to deform. And then you sort of push the person into the IP. So yes, we do have them. We do have them for the back, not for frontal, because there's not very many injuries for that. We also have airbags between the two people, you know, in bigger trucks. There's something that comes out on like a Suburban. They come out over here to keep you in this little zone of cushion, supposedly, but their merit is probably not measurable, because it may happen, but those types of accidents are relatively rare. So I was giving you the numbers for like 1 out of 250 for a frontal accident per year. And it's like, let's say, a fifth of that for a side impact. So somebody hit T-boning you, and it's half of that again for a rollover type accident, or you might need some of the side airbags. That's a terrible answer, but there's just not many injuries from a rear impact. We do have them for the side. You know, that's why I have the sensor back there. There's a side. If you can't make the big airbag that comes down from the top work in a side impact, you put a little small one that comes out of the seat. And some of your seats, you may have, you know, this SRS warning, meaning don't stick it with a knife or something like that. You don't want to do that. And if there's an airbag in there. So, anything else?
How about rear collisions? Is there, so what happens in a rear
That's a
collision?
good question. So so when it hits you from behind, you're being forced into the seat. And so that part is not so bad, but it's the rebound when you start going forward again, that's a problem. And so how it's addressed, you don't deploy the airbags, but you do deploy the seat belts. So make the seat belts grab you a little bit better so you don't go flying forward after rebound. So when it hits you from the back, you're being forced backwards. And then on the rebound part where you're going, you know, after the initial impact, you're going to go forward again. They make the seatbelt grab you a little bit more. So the pretensioners go off, tension the seatbelt. Are the seats designed? Yes. So I'm not a seat guy, but yeah, they are designed. As a matter of fact, if you saw that Malibu video, you see that the seat is deforming a little bit, and it's deforming, trying to slow you down a little bit. So it's funny you mentioned that, though. They are supposedly designed for it, but occasionally you'll see a recall because they didn't quite meet the standards of a rear impact. So they are designed for it, but for some reason, though we've been building furniture for a long time, we don't always get it right. So.
And the, you know, like guardrail and stuff like that. I know when those ends are designed similar to what the car does. They're crushable.
Yeah.
They move and they slow you down. And
Yeah.
so and they're very expensive also.
Yeah, yeah, you know, and I agree with it. All that expensive. My interior trim was very expensive in my accident. But if instead of that deer, that was that Bel Air that I hit, I'd be most grateful that my airbags went off, and it'd be way worth all the total car for a relatively minor hit if it saved my wife's life. You know, so yeah, it's a trade-off, and what you're trading off is something really valuable. But you know, by the way, had you seen that they just did some tests on guardrails and things like that? And, electric cars are a lot heavier than regular cars. The battery weighs a lot. And the guardrails apparently are not capable of stopping an electric car hitting them. Cars drive right through them. So interesting, particularly electric trucks.
My mom had a GMC Terrain, which is a Equinox
It
equivalent,
sure is.
and she got hit in the side, and she pulled out in front of somebody and got hit in the side, and those side deployed, and one of them, I mean, because she's an older lady and her skin was very thin, so
So that's what I had.
but it saved her
saved my
head.
head from hitting. And
Yes.
that's exactly what I had. I had an abrasion on my arm that was sort of in this arm, abrasion on my arm, actually it was on the back of my hand. As the airbag came down and essentially sanded my hand essentially when it came up, when it went by.
Years ago, it seemed like the big three always fought all these safety features tooth and nail from the feds. Over your career, did that stay the same, or has there been a more cooperative relationship over the years?
I don't know, so not at my level. So at my level was do it and I was off to do it. And a lot of times it took invention to do it. So I had a lot of patents for some of this stuff. Not that I saw very much money for it, but I do have a lot of patents.
Well, because, you had cars like the Pinto and the Corvair,
Oh,
those
yeah.
old ones that were unsafe at any speed or whatever,
No.
those kind of things,
That's like the Bel Air you just saw, right? I mean, they just were not made for a crash. As a matter of fact, so that what's very interesting is that in Insurance Institute, they do something interesting. They crash American cars against cars from other countries, and in particular, ones from Mexico, because they don't have much in the line of standards there. And the cars are kind of like what we would build in the 70s. Matter of fact, they are cars that would be built in the 70s. They just, Nissan would sell their tools to, or they would transfer their tools to Mexico. They built something that was made in the 70s in Mexico when it's still being used, and they crash the two versions of the car. And it's the same thing as that Bel Air. The modern version just sort of drives right through the older version. So things have gotten better. And things in the United States are good. Everybody tries to copy us, I think. So
Well, and then if you survive and say have, you're quadriplegic or whatever, just think of the millions of dollars that it costs for somebody when they survive and they're,
no, I
I mean,
agree.
so I mean, these are and that, it doesn't happen very often, but it could.
No, it does happen. Obviously, 1 out of 4,000 chance is your chance per year, and there's a lot of thousands of people in the United States that have a fatal or near fatal accident. And the idea is to mitigate injuries, but quite frankly, if you're going 90 miles an hour, that airbag probably will kill you a fraction of a second faster as it hits you before the rest of the steel comes to hit you. There's only so much you can do if you're going too fast. So, and I investigated a crash that the airbags didn't deploy. It was a side impact. And, I look at this person driving not a train, call it the Lambda internal General Motors, but driving a General Motors van-ish type vehicle. And for some reason, she stopped at a stop sign, and then pulled out. But there was a gravel hauler coming down the road, a laden dump truck fully loaded. She pulled right out in front of it. It hit her, and the airbags didn't deploy. And, the government, NHTSA came to me or came to our group, who then was assigned to me. Like, why didn't these deploy? And I'm like, well, okay. So we looked at it, did the crash analysis, and there was only a few milliseconds. The truck was going 55 miles an hour. And as I said, there's really only this much space between you and the dump truck going at 55 miles an hour. And this dump truck happened to hit exactly where the door met the body of the vehicle, and exactly where the wires went. And so, by the way, so that thing, the airbag controller, records a lot of stuff in the crash. So it's recording how you're driving before you get in a crash, all the accelerations that happened during a crash, how the crash unfolded as far as all the sensors are seeing. And so from their data, we can see that just barely detected something, but by that time, this dump truck had just sliced right through the truck. And then the government's like, well, what can you do to solve that? And I'm like, well, here, the kinetic energy of that dump truck hitting you was like a tank shell hitting the side of the car. I mean, even if we put it inside of a steel rod, you wouldn't be able to open the door. But even if we did that, it wouldn't have stuck up. It wouldn't have held up to that dump truck. There's only so much you can do. The next step is something called active safety, where the car tries to stop you from doing stuff like that. And, supposedly Tesla has one, right? And that's, so well, that's working. And it does, it actually does work. I've seen their data, the autopilot. The crash rates are lower for driving on autopilots. Only problem is that the crashes that you get into, because autopilot is as smart as the computer, right? They're horrific crashes. Like a person could easily avoided that crash, but the computer didn't recognize it as being in danger. But the actual crash rates are lower autopilot. And same with General Motors has a similar thing. It's called adaptive cruise, some of the next level up, but super cruise, where the vehicle drives itself. The rates are lower, but if somebody has spilled a bunch of paint on the road and there's construction at the same spot, and so all the cues that a camera might see and the radar might see are kind of gone, and it's different than what the vehicle's programmed to, it can make a mistake. But that is the way to go. That's how to, actually, the easiest thing to do is wire-to-wire communication between vehicles. That's so easy. That'll solve all the problems. The only problem is everybody would have to pay for that to be put into their vehicle. So think of a internet for your vehicles, all the vehicles near you. It's like, oh, I'm coming to this intersection. I'm not going to stop. Oh, I better slow down. That would all be known, and the vehicle could just brake. I'm sorry, you had a question.
How do you treat that? It's kind of an AI mistake, any different than a driver error?
Well, no, you're right. AI error, and that's exactly it. AI error is only as good as you're programmed, right? And a driver error. The easiest way, I think, is if you had vehicle-to-vehicle communication. So why have a camera that needs to tell you where the vehicle is? Because if it just told me where it was, if that other vehicle just told me where it was and it was coming to this intersection, I'd know. And I wouldn't have to make all this image processing of this vehicle coming into this intersection. And or you could have smart roads, but again, it's cost. Smart roads would be a government cost, so that's never going to happen. Vehicle-to-vehicle communication, you'd have to worry about people thinking, oh, well, the government now knows where I'm driving, I'm going to turn it off, and if you depend on it too much, then it wouldn't work. So.
See, we at MDOT, when we got involved in lawsuits, if the person survived and they were, say, confined to a wheelchair, and that became a court case, that was always huge loser. It was cheaper if somebody died, unfortunately.
Well, yeah, because first of all, because you're in the courtroom and there's the person right there, right? So I get called a lot, and particularly from people who work from General Motors, like, oh, I got in a crash, my airbags didn't go off. And I'm like, well, you're calling me. Are you okay? Yeah, but my airbags didn't go off. Well, then he probably didn't need to go off. You're not hurt. It's only there to stop you from being hurt. And that's what a lot of people think. So anytime I'm in a crash, my airbags go off. Actually, you don't want them to go off. Mine is a perfect example if you don't want it to go off. I mean, it took my car that was 6 months old, and it had to throw it away. Well, and actually, and you don't want things, again, I wasn't kidding. Did anybody watch Jack Reacher at all? He walks up to the car and he punches it and makes the airbags go off. Now that's not going to happen. Actually, you don't want that to happen, right? It'll become a game. Teenagers would run out in the intersection and hit your car with the bat and run away, and your airbags go off, and your car would be total.
Because we hit a deer almost exactly like you did, maybe going a little bit slower, but it was by Rogers City, and it was a Ford Edge.
Well, so Rogers City deer, that's why it's different.
Yeah, well,
Posen deer.
and see, and there was $6,000 damage to the front of the car, but the airbags did not deploy for us, and it was almost the same hit as you had.
So actually, and it depends on the vintage of the vehicle. So I happen to have my sensors were exactly on there. But we actually do a test where we hit a fake deer at 35 miles an hour and it shouldn't go off. I was just going faster than that. And it was a nice direct hit too, so. And he was kind of bounding, so I don't know if you noticed, but my bumper didn't quite impact the bumper right away. It hit high right where the sensor would be as he crushed the top of the hood. And if I'd have hit him if it had caught the bumper, then he'd have probably, so I would have sped him up before he hit the hood and he wouldn't have crushed the hood as much, so.
Well, thank you so much, John. Any other questions?
And if you have any questions on, and not that I'll be able to answer it, but I certainly could get somebody to answer it if you want to. If, you're in a crash and you didn't think something worked the way it should have, let me know. And look at it, especially if you have pictures, so.
Thank you so much, John.